Hello, everyone. My name is Reese Garlinsky, and this is Where You Want to Be, where I take you with me around the world to learn about it. I've been lucky enough to study history in college, as well as travel around the world, study history, and learn it from the people that live in these places. My goal here is to help you come with me around the world so that you could find your place within this world and learn about the world and how you connect to it. Today, we are talking about Berlin, the capital of the great country of Germany, with a bunch of history and all that. So we're going to cover the history in a short form of Berlin, and we're going to talk about some travel, we're going to talk about some cool facts, and I'm going to give you guys my general just advice for going to Berlin. So with that, we are going to open with some cool facts. And the fact I always like to open with is the etymology. So Berlin itself likely comes from a Western Slavic term, Berl, which literally translates to marshland or swampland, because of the fact that Berlin sits upon a kind of wetland that comes from the Spree River. It sits right on the banks of the Spree River because, of course, every civilization and its city needs a water source, and that was the one for Berlin. Now, there is a lot of debate over some older legends that claim to be the etymology of Berlin, but most of those have been dismissed as folklore and fake etymology. So we're going to talk about the one that was real, and with that, I'm going to move into some other facts. Another cool fact about Berlin is the fact that Berlin is incredible architecturally. Now, not only is Berlin by far the largest city in Germany, but it also is a city that has even more bridges than Venice, a city extremely famous for its bridges and canals and all the little steps you have to take. Venice is expected to have a plethora of bridges, but Germany has even more, clocking in at over 1,700 bridges in the city limits of Berlin. Now, another one is that on top of the fact that it is the biggest in Germany, and it has 1,700 bridges, more than Venice, it is also a city that is 9 times bigger than Paris. Paris, which is already one of the most visited and most famous cities in the world, Berlin absolutely topples it in size and dwarfs it because of how big Berlin is. And another thing about Berlin's size is the fact that Berlin's city is very diverse. Over 44% of Berlin's city is parks, waterways, and kind of lakes, different things that are not urbanized giant structures. So it is one of the greenest and cleanest cities in Germany and in the greater region itself. And the final fact I'm going to give you is one that blew my mind. This is about the Berlin public transit system. Now, Berlin is massive, and it has a massive transport system to support it. That includes buses, trams, subways, and so many more different ways to get around the city. And this system is so expansive that to operate it for one day, for it to send all the routes through the subway, all the driving through the buses, all the different connections on trams, all of that, the length of all of those added up goes around the earth 8.7 times every single day. That is how vast that system is and how many meters and feet are covered every single time those systems are launched, because a whole day of running them would encircle the earth 8 times over. So yes, that is giving you some scale here. As you guys know, Berlin is famous for being where the Cold War had a lot of its focus on. It has hundreds of years of history, thousands even before that. And of course, Germany itself is so known for its engineers, its musicians, its art, just kind of dominating anything it's ever done. So with that, I want to transition into the history and just say thank you guys for being interested in this. Thank you for listening so far. And I'm not going to dilly-dally any further than that. So this is going to be my traveler's notes on Berlin, and this is going to be the short history of Berlin. So I hope you guys enjoy. Our origins begin ages ago, with the first people living here at least 50,000 years ago. But what we're going to focus on is the Germanic peoples. Different Germanic tribes formed into clans and created familial ties that eventually turned into development. The first real development we're going to focus on for Berlin was one called the Margravate of Brandenburg. Berlin was first part of a Germanic unit. This was in the 1100s, and up until this point had kind of been just a thing. It was just this development. It was a settlement here. It's the first time we really get to track Berlin and Berlin forward is when it's become a part of the Margravate of Brandenburg. Now, the first person to affect this area was a ruler named Albert the Bear. He's the one who actually incorporated Berlin into that Margravate. And his name, Albert the Bear, is a big connection to Berlin, according to some. This is where that folklore I mentioned before comes from, where the real etymology of Berlin connects to swamps and marshes. It's from this man, Albert the Bear, that the connection to bear, or the German word Bach, is first established, where people thought Berlin derived from his name, Albert the Bear. But that is considered folklore and not real etymology compared to now. Now, I've been using the term Berlin because I don't really know what to describe the land here as outside of Berlin, but when this city actually starts is debated among historians. But what I've heard often is 1237 is considered the start date of the Berlin we know. It's not official. It's not like a Rome where we could say, oh, it's on this day that these brothers fought and Romulus rose up. It's much more loose than that. But 1237 is a date that's thrown around a lot as where we will start the beginning of the real Berlin. Now, in the 1400s, things changed. In those 200 years between, 1237 and the 1400s, Berlin just developed. It established the basics of development. It had a king that they bent to, that was the Brandenburgs. And then in these 1400s, something changed. Berlin actually made a connection with Cologne, which is a nearby city. They became a unit, one city known as Berlin-Cologne. They create this alliance where they become one city because of the fact that a passageway was built between the two cities. And this led them to directly understanding that they could just trade with each other and became a unit right after this. So that is in the year 1432. Now, these two powers traded a lot of things. They traded oak wood, herring, as well as other goods that were popular in the area. They were so close to the Spree River that the herring was easy to get. They were able to trade a lot of oak because of the fact that there's forests all over different parts of Germany. And all of this led them to unite into one. And as I said, 1437. Now, things continue onward. Berlin was one of the free cities associated with the Hanseatic League, which meant that they had a free trade agreement but weren't fully part of the Hanseatic League. The Hanseatic League is a thing I've mentioned 1,000 times. It was a northern German kind of group of knights and traders, so it not only spread Christianity and was knights that fought against paganism and everything they fought against, but also was kind of a trade bloc. It had a monopoly on the trade on the Baltics, in the North Sea, things like that to really dominate things going through northern Germany. It was very influential in Hamburg, it was very influential in Copenhagen, Stockholm, all those things, and led to, those northern countries separating to their own thing and kind of united the Baltics and other ones under one unit. And that lasted until the death of Frederick I, who was part of the Brandenburgs, and this was in 1440. What happened next was the Hohenzollern family took over the city and then became the Kaisers that ruled Germany for centuries. And they had their royal palace and their royal residence in general in Berlin. And then we roll into the 1500s. In 1539, Lutheranism swept into Berlin, and it was made the official faith of the city. This led to a great division with other parts of Germany that remained stoutly Catholic and Greater Europe that also remained stoutly Catholic. Then in 1576, Berlin was hit hard by the Black Plague. About 5,000 people died in the city, and despite this, the population still grew. By the year 1600, the population of Berlin was able to hit 12,000, despite losing almost half of that to the Black Plague in the same century. Then in the 1600s, the effects of Lutheranism and all that were felt heavily. The biggest moment here is the 30 Years' War. In the 30 Years' War, devoutly on the Protestant side is Berlin, and the Protestant allies sometimes stationed in Berlin. Sometimes Berlin is attacked. Berlin is heavily involved in the fighting and the war in general, and is a part of the negotiations after because of the fact that the war affected it so much and affected Greater Europe so much. So the biggest part of the 1600s is the fact that Berlin saw so much fighting in the 30 Years' War, and a big reason for this was the fact that a third of Berlin was destroyed. That's why Berlin was so passionate about being a part of the solution and being in the war, was because the war affected it so greatly. A third of the entire city was destroyed, and much of the population perished. According to what I have here, half of the population actually passed away during this event. 1600 was the year Berlin hit 12,000, and before it even hit 1650, the population boomed to almost 20,000. This allowed more people of different faiths, including Judaism, newer sects of Christianity, all of that to kind of influx into Berlin and make it a mixed melting pot city that it still represents in many ways today. The 1700s are defined by the era of Prussia. Frederick III also became king at this time and named Berlin as the capital of Prussia. And in this period, Prussia, which was, a state of Germanic peoples, dominated. It became very powerful. It started to move forward into eventually unifying all of Germany. And in order to get a foothold in Berlin, Berlin was developed heavily. A lot of different people came into Berlin because they knew that they wanted a foothold in Prussia. They wanted to get access to Prussia that was growing, the culture, the arts, the fact that it was literally taking more and more land through different wars. So banks opened up in Berlin, newer developments. The city was beautified, modernized. All of these things happened in the 1700s as Prussia started to develop into the most important part of what became Greater Germany. In the 1800s, Germany unified. The leading power behind this was Prussia and its military leaders like Otto von Bismarck, as well as many other ones. And with this, the unification that took wars with Austria, Prussia, economic unification, all these things, once it officially unified, the fact that Prussia was the main person and body behind it meant that Berlin was a de facto capital. Once it became the capital, it meant that all of these other Germans were now coming to see it. There was Bavarians, people living near Bohemia, all these different groups of what is now one big Germany came to see their capital, and frankly, they were disgusted. They thought it was dirty. They thought it was unorganized. They didn't understand why it was the way it was, and that was because of the fact that there was nearly none, or if none at all, plumbing or a sewage system at all in Berlin, and this needed to be changed. The Germans that came outside of Berlin and now came to their capital didn't stand for this. So over the next few decades, heavy developments were made, both into a plumbing system, a sewage system, but also just into Berlin in general. There was a lot of beautification projects done. Think wider boulevards, massive monuments, the beautification of certain churches. The city was just modernized and beautified very heavily. And this was much bigger than any developments that had been made before because of the fact that now it was all of Germany working on one capital rather than just Prussia or some supporters in that way. The 1900s rolled in, and they rolled in very, very hard on Germany and Berlin. This was a terrible start, especially through World War I for Berlin. The city was absolutely crushed by the actual war itself. When the war ended, the concessions Berlin had to make, the reparations it paid, all these things were brutal. And on top of that, the monarchy that helped develop Berlin and Greater Germany was physically dismantled by the rest of Europe. The Weimar Republic was the next governing body of Germany and Berlin, which took a lot of root in Berlin after the monarchy was dismantled. And it was still a very hard time. It's sometimes compared to a good time from what I've seen in history, where certain people felt like they benefited at this time, where most Germans, and maybe most in Berlin, felt that it was a terrible time, where the rest of Europe was absolutely looking down on Germany, was treating them awfully for a war that, yes, they were a major part of, but weren't the only, perpetrator in. It wasn't like the coming up one, where it was definitively one fault, where it was definitively one bad guy. This was a lot of different powers and things triggered and things that caused the First World War. But Germany and Berlin was held very accountable, and Berlin struggled. However, at this time, Berlin was actually kind of seen as a scientific and cultural hub throughout the 1920s when the Weimar Republic was in power. Despite all the struggles, there was developments in art, literature, because of the fact that the German people, the Berliners, were suffering so hard that they put it into art, they put it into paintings, they put it into words. And they were making scientific developments to hopefully get back on their feet. One of the biggest contributors to this was actually Albert Einstein, who was living in Berlin throughout this decade. The world economy crashed in 1929 because of Black Tuesday and everything that went down with Wall Street. What followed was massive effects on Berlin, a city that was hit harder than almost any in the world. 450,000 workers in Berlin were laid off at this time. Yes, 450,000. This led to long lines for people trying to get food. This led to citywide struggle, and it was mirrored by Greater Germany itself. Things started to change, though, in 1932 when a man named Paul von Hindenburg won the presidency, and it was him who actually elected the Austrian painter to be Chancellor of Germany. Then, after being in power for just 2 years, Hindenburg died and ended up leaving the Austrian painter to use his power as Chancellor to very much extend what he could do, and this led to him becoming the de facto leader of Berlin and Germany, and eventually becoming the leader of the Yahtzee party and everything else that follows. Now, this leader, the Austrian painter, wanted Berlin to be a megapolis. He wanted it to be a massive capital of what he called Germania, which reflected heavily the beliefs of Aryan superiority and the fact that people who looked German had German features like red blonde hair, blue eyes, pale skin, represented, the master race, as he said. He felt the ultimate representation of this would be the capital of Germania, which he saw as Berlin, being heavily developed. He wanted it to look like ancient Greece, ancient Rome, because in his mind, the legacy of those empires lasted forever, and he thought this empire would also last forever. So there was beautification projects done under the Austrian painter that affected Berlin with the hope that it would become this mega Germania capital, as he often stated. Berlin was the military and beating capital of all things that the Austrian painter wanted to do. It was the base of operations. It was everything. Berlin was a target. And as time went on, Berlin was eventually attacked. On April 16th, 1945, the Red Army marched on Berlin, making the effort to capture the Austrian painter and end the European theater of war. This was not an easy task, though. Berlin was armed to the teeth and well defended. There was hundreds of thousands of soldiers present in the city trying to keep the effort alive under the orders of the Austrian painter. The results of this is one of the worst battles in human history. I'll bring up some numbers now. 80,000 Soviets passed or disappeared, and over 200,000 were injured in this battle. Germany lost 90,000 or more soldiers and saw at least 100,000 wounded. On top of all of this, though, there was a greater cost. Berlin was heavily attacked and destroyed. Not only the mega projects that the Austrian painter was building to try and beautify and make Berlin the city he wanted it to be, but even worse was the 300,000 Berliners that lost their lives because of this singular battle. The Battle of Berlin is one of the worst in history. Of course, there's Stalingrad and all the ones that happened in the East that put up mega numbers at this time, but in the European theater of war, few had as horrible an effect on civilians as the Battle of Berlin. After weeks of brutal fighting, the military garrison for Germany eventually surrendered on May 2nd, which is a day still celebrated today, and this was when the Austrian painter turned the blade on himself, and things that followed led to the end of the European theater of war. And now the history that follows the end of the Second World War is the Cold War, where Berlin is by far the most important city in any part of the world when it comes to the Cold War. It was a hot point for battles between Western and Eastern ideals, between capitalist and communist ideals. All of them clashed here, and I'm going to go through some of the history because it is very in-depth, which I will cover at another time. But to start, Berlin was jointly occupied by the four big powers: the USSR, the United States, Britain, and France, even though they did battle France. But nonetheless, the western part was occupied by the four powers: the United States, Britain, and France. The eastern part, Eastern Berlin itself, and just Eastern Germany in general, was occupied by the Soviets. It was a weird thing where even though Berlin was part of the Soviet bloc, it was behind what was called the Iron Curtain. Berlin itself was split in two. West Berlin was the capitalist, more west-leaning side, where the eastern part, Berlin, followed Soviet rules and was much more blocked off. In order to weaken East Berlin, the Soviets attempted to starve them out. There was blockades made so that they couldn't get food from West Berlin, and this triggered the 1948 Berlin airlift. This is when 277,000 flights, more than that actually, were flown into Berlin to drop off supplies so that these people could eat, they could clean their babies, they could clean themselves. Supplies of all sorts were used here to try and stimulate the survival and growth of East Berlin and also to push them towards Western ideals. Now, recent year has actually showed that manuscripts from this time suggest that there was a lot of issues with the Berlin airlift. They say that a lot of the supplies actually crushed people because it fell from the sky so fast, and that on the other side of it, some of the supplies broke in the air and rained down from above very softly, but it made the food and the stuff inside unusable. So there was ups and downs to this, but this was the Berlin airlift, an attempt to kind of stop the blockade and attempted starvation by the Soviets in East Berlin. By 1961, 20% of East Berliners had moved west to Berlin. That's about 3.5 million people based on the population of East Berlin. Because of this, there was a lot of reason for the Soviets to be upset. And later in this year, from August 12th to 13th, they started to line hundreds of meters of the Berlin east-west border with barbed wire and fences. By 1965, hundreds and hundreds of meters of this wall was replaced by unclimbable 12 feet tall concrete slabs. This was the line in the sand. This said that East Berliners were trapped behind the Soviet Union. They were trapped behind Soviet lines. This is years after Winston Churchill had declared the division between Western and Eastern Europe the Iron Curtain, but this was an even greater trap. People who lived in East Berlin were not going anywhere, and this was the status quo for the greater Soviet area. You couldn't leave Budapest, you couldn't leave Czechoslovakia, you couldn't leave anywhere that was behind the Iron Curtain. To complement this, there was this about 100-meter stretch of just straight sand that all the buildings had been destroyed between East Berlin and West Berlin. So even if you managed to get through some of the security measures, you now had to deal with guard towers, guard dogs, constant monitoring, and entering this strip, which was pretty much a shoot-on-sight area where if anyone were to enter this area and the guard caught it, they were no longer considered someone they needed to protect. Over the next 2 decades, things started to change. Over 5,000 people from East Berlin were able to escape west to West Berlin, except from what we know, 138 people who attempted this escape were killed by the Soviet guards, and that's what we know about for now. On top of this, in the 1980s, Mikhail Gorbachev took over as the Soviet premier and started to change relations. He wanted to be closer to the U.S. and to Ronald Reagan than his predecessors. He was much more accepting than Stalin and much more accepting than his other premiers that had previously led the entire Soviet Union. In 1987, a deal was signed between Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev. It stated that there would be a limit on the production and distribution of mid-range nuclear missiles. This was seen as a huge step towards ending the Cold War, the arms race, and all things that came with it between the east and western part of Europe and the world. There was many protests that followed this as well. East Berliners were protesting for the right to travel, and West Berliners were protesting for their neighbors, family members, and all that trapped behind the Iron Curtain and trapped behind the Berlin Wall to be free. The biggest protest happened in 1989 when over 500,000 people gathered in Berlin and Ronald Reagan gave a riveting speech. This speech ending with the line, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." It's made famous rounds both on the internet and today, and it was all over the headlines back then. It was a strong call to end this division, and it was one of the last triumphant things that happened before the Berlin Wall actually came down. This major protest occurred on November 4th, 1989. What followed 5 days later was capitulation. The Soviets agreed. They said, you know what? We give in. It's fine. East Berliners were declared that they could go to West Berlin. They could finally breach the wall and go past back to their city, back to loved ones, back to all of that. But there was a miscommunication. The goal was for, by the end of the night, legalities to be signed and to be done officially. But people heard this early in the morning on November 9th, and certain people said it on the wrong radio stations, on the wrong ways for people to hear it, and they marched. East Berliners marched to the wall and demanded that the guards let them pass. Some of them were met with a lot of violence and a lot of defensiveness, but they were able to push past, and by the end of the night on November 9th, everyone was reunited. Families that had been separated for decades were finally met by their family members marching from East Berlin across the border of the wall to come to West Berlin, to make one Berlin once again. Much of the wall was destroyed, but some of it was kept as a remembrance. Decades of separation, decades of the Cold War, all of it felt like it was finally coming to an end as family members and people who simply lived on the wrong side of Berlin finally came back to their true home. It wasn't until October of 1990 that Berlin officially reunited as one city. So now that we've done the survey of some history for Berlin, we could actually get into some of the historical sites and then get into my tips for actually traveling to Berlin. Our first historical site is the Reichstag building. This neo-Renaissance building was designed by Paul Wallet and constructed between 1884 and 1894. It was the seat of the Reichstag legislature during the German Empire from 1871 to 1918, and then the Weimar Republic from 1919 to the 1930s. The Reichstag was the site of the proclamation of the German Republic in 1918. On February 27, 1933, the Reichstag was set on fire. This was an event that led to the Austrian painters' political party getting in power. This same party's leadership used the fire to claim that communists were planning an uprising, so they did it and then claimed that it was another group that caused it. This led to the Reichstag fire decree. This decree suspended constitutional protections, including freedom of speech, freedom of press, and the right to assemble. This was all used to control the population and lead to the Second World War. The Reichstag was partially restored in the 1970s and became a museum of German history and also a history of the reunification of Germany. After the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1990, the Reichstag was extensively restored and renovated by the British architect Sir Norman Foster. The restoration included the rebuilding of the building's glass dome, which offers 360-degree views of Berlin and is one of the most famous sites in the city. Also, after the Cold War, it became the Capitol building of Berlin. The next spot is going to be Lustgarten. The Lustgarten is a park on Museum Island in central Berlin. The area of the Lustgarten was originally developed in the 1500s as a kitchen garden attached to the palace that the then residents of the Elector of Brandenburg were at, the core of the later Kingdom of Prussia. After the devastation of Germany during the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, Berlin was redeveloped by Friedrich Wilhelm and his Dutch wife, Louise Henriette of Nassau. It was Louise, with the assistance of a military engineer and a landscape gardener named Michael Henf, in 1647 that led to the conversion of the former kitchen garden into a formal garden with fountains, geometric paths, and gave it its current name, which is something that a lot of people come to see. Next is the Memorial to the Murdered Jews. Also known as the Holocaust Memorial, was first proposed in 1988 by journalist Leah Roche and historian Eberhard Jackel. An international competition was held to select the memorial's design because of so many people wanting to put a real contribution in Berlin, which was the heart of the Austrian Patriots Party, which was the heart of the Holocaust. So they wanted to do this art piece to kind of counter all that was preaching and do a really good tribute to all the people that were lost during this terrible event, which was the Holocaust. After initial designs were rejected, a second competition was won by an American architect named Peter Eisenman and sculptor Richard Serra. Construction began in 2001 in the heart of Berlin, near the Brandenburg Gate. The memorial, completed in 2005, consists of 2,711 concrete pillars of varying heights arranged in a grid pattern across 19,000 square meters. The memorial was officially opened to the public on May 10, 2005, on the 60th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe. It includes an underground information center with exhibits and personal stories of people who survived the Holocaust. And the final spot I will mention is the Brandenburg Gate. The most outright famous structure in Berlin is this gate. This gate was constructed between 1788 and 1791 under the commission of Prussian King Frederick Wilhelm II. Karl Gotthard Langhans was the lead designer. It was originally conceived as a symbol of peace, and the gate featured a grand design with 12 Doric columns forming 5 passageways. The quadriga, a chariot drawn by 4 horses and driven by the goddess of victory, crowns the structure. The gate embodies neoclassical structures and takes inspiration from the Propylaea of Athens, Greece. The quadriga statue that adorns the top of the gate was taken as a trophy of the war by Napoleon during the Napoleonic Wars. This gate was a powerful symbol of unity during German unification and also during the struggles of the Second World War. Also during this war, the gate was badly damaged, but it completely changed the way it stood. It ended up being a symbol of division in the Cold War, as the Berlin Wall blocked off public access to the gate for many people in Berlin. The gate wasn't fully repaired until the 2000s after the wall had fallen, and today it is the most famous and well-visited site in all of Berlin. And now that we've done the history of certain sites, we're going to get into my final travel tips here and start to wrap up. My first recommendation is if you do plan to visit the Reichstag building, please book that tour early. It is super popular, it sells out fast, and sometimes they don't even take walk-up tickets during peak season. This was the case for when I went on my first day. I was in Berlin for about 4 nights. Wanted to go see the Reichstag early on to spend the rest of my time doing longer tours. Absolutely did not have any type of... So definitely book early and definitely plan to get this one plotted for you so that you aren't struggling to find a way there. Because the 360-degree view at the top of the building is a very cool way to end off what is already a very, very cool type of historical and kind of political history thing in Berlin. My second recommendation is kind of a don't do that leads into a thing you should do. The first is do not eat currywurst at Charlie's Beach. So this is an open market that was near some of the Berlin Wall displays, right at the area of the, not far from the area of the memorial to the murdered Jews. And it's very touristy, I feel like, and the prices are weird, and just the quality isn't what you expect, even though Berlin is known for having currywurst and having it as a dish people have, and many people go to Berlin with the intention of, I'll try this here because I'll try some actual German dishes. But this is not the place to do it. What I do recommend is getting it at Curry 61. This was by far the best food I had in Berlin. Not only was the quality of the currywurst so much better, the sauce was good, just the overall flow of the place was so much cooler. It felt more authentic because it was kind of a walk-up window bar where you got both your currywurst and your drink, and the beers were affordable. The whole thing was more affordable. It was much more just authentic in my feeling, so I definitely recommend eating there. That's Curry 61, as in Curry 61. And then my final recommendation is actually going to be specifically is to make friends with 2 British guys and have the time of your life going out that night. I'm only half kidding. That is because in Berlin, I met 2 of my fantastic and best friends in all of Europe. That is Will and Matt. These guys are 2 wonderful Brits that absolutely made my trip and were the most fun thing I did pretty much probably in the entire country of Germany. But I'm going to shout them out, so shout out to you boys. I hope you lads are well and living it up well in England. But my final real recommendation is this. That is to do a walking tour. And I can recommend a couple of different free ones, but if you look up free walking tour and you do it and it's multiple hours long, you know you're getting the good stuff. Berlin is massive. As I said, it's 9 times bigger than Paris. So walking around the different parts of the museum island and all the different historical sites, it takes ages. I mean, this was one of the longest walking tours I did in all of Europe, and I did a whole lot of walking tours as I went across Europe, and because they're one of the best ways to really understand a city as a foreign American who knows little to nothing. Even as a guy who studied history, there's still nothing like being there. I recommend these ones in Berlin specifically because the city is massive, and you'll not only get good recommendations for where to do things after the tour from these people, as you always do on these walking tours, but to get a real understanding of Berlin and the vast difference between different parts of Berlin and how it really is so many different kind of towns and cities coming into one, and that Berlin is not just one city. You'll understand this and learn this so much better from this walking tour and grow to appreciate the size and all that if you do it. So I definitely recommend doing this. My tip for doing it is make sure you get a really good night of sleep before, because you'll be bobbing your head and all that, because it is, it's a lot of talking and walking. And if you did what I did and not get a good sleep beforehand, where I came in from Hamburg the night before on a long journey in the middle of the night after delayed trains, it made it harder. Very glad I did it because I met my great friends here, but it's definitely something I think you should do on a level head. So I definitely, as I said, recommend getting caffeine and sleeping and making sure you're good to go for this so you could really appreciate the glory of the capital city of the great country of Germany. And now that we've covered both the abridged history of Berlin, we've talked about some different historical sites, and we've talked about my travel tips for if you go to this awesome city, that is going to be the end for us today. I do hope you guys enjoyed, and I always do appreciate you guys watching this stuff with me and watching me, yap about history and the things I've been lucky enough to be a part of, both places and events and all of that. So, once again, I want to shout out my boys, Will and Matt. Absolutely made my Berlin trip, and then I've actually also traveled to London to see them, and I did that before some of their friends from England did, so your boys got to step it up. But yeah, man, just very happy I get to do this, very happy to be putting this stuff out. So I wish you guys well, and of course, if you guys like this, just go ahead and hit a like for me, hit that subscribe to see what I'm going to put out next, because I've got a whole lot more cities to talk about, more countries, more world events, all of that. So with that being said, hope you guys enjoyed, and my name is Reese. This is where you want to be, and that was our episode on Berlin. You guys have a good one.